So we now return to developments in Europe in connection with state formation. And in this particular lecture, we're focusing primarily on the fact that governments are beginning to have real direct authority over their territories, in large part because they're developing very effective bureaucracies, right? So kind of a centralization of authority within the hands of the government. At this point, primarily, we're talking about monarchies. And we're going to begin by looking at developments in the United Kingdom. So first, I just want to clarify what constitutes the United Kingdom, right? Because sometimes there's a bit of confusion. United Kingdom is not the same thing as England. In fact, it is in effect a union between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland, though also including the Principality of Wales and Northern Ireland, if we're talking about the United Kingdom today. The Principality of Wales, we have this arrangement that evolved that in theory, the Prince of Wales, who in theory has authority over Wales, is also the heir to the British throne. Northern Ireland, a remnant of what had been formerly a colony of the United Kingdom, the larger majority of which eventually became independent, forming the Republic of Ireland, but the northern component choosing to remain within the United Kingdom. And we, just by way of being factually accurate, we should note that some of those smaller islands that you see surrounding the mainland of the United Kingdom, the Isle of Man, the Isle of Wight, are actually separate components. But the four main components, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we're actually beginning our story prior to the union of the two kingdoms of England and Scotland. And so initially we're going to focus on developments in England, beginning with the reign of Elizabeth I, who was Queen of England from 1558 until her death in 1603. The daughter of Henry VIII, who we met in connection with the Protestant Reformation in England. And more properly, we might say Elizabeth I of England, the current monarch of the United Kingdom, by the way, Elizabeth II of England, but the first of Scotland. And so at the time of her reign, and we had discussed this briefly before now, but a kind of informal arrangement had evolved by this point where the monarch had to cooperate with the parliament in governing, particularly in connection with anything pertaining to revenue. So for instance, if the monarch wanted to issue or new taxes or raise existing taxes, she needed the approval of the parliament. Kind of the idea that they were responsible for the purse. And again, this is kind of an informal arrangement, right? There's nothing resembling a constitution designating who has which authorities, which responsibilities. And we might also note the Parliament is at this point already perceived as a kind of representative body of the English people, consisting of two main components: the House of Lords, which would have represented nobles, right? This kind of tripartite structure of the three estates that we've talked about before, though also kind of representing the clergy as well in some regards. And then you have the House of Commons representing commoners, but to be clear, we're talking about wealthy commoners, either members of the gentry class who would have been wealthy commoners, who in many ways resemble the nobles. Their wealth was primarily in the form of large landed estates, but also including wealthy commoners whose wealth was derived of trade, wealthy merchants and so forth, many of whom would have been based in the city of London. And in fact, even today, the Parliament consists of these two main components, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And at the time of Elizabeth's reign, there's kind of a burning religious issue that reflects a sense that the change initiated by Henry VIII has yet to be completed, right? So we talked about how under Henry VIII, the church in England had broken with the Pope, and we see the establishment of the Anglican Church, sometimes referred to as the Church of England. So no longer recognizing the authority of the Pope, but and his authority replaced by the monarch, but pretty much in every respect, still very much like the Catholic Church, right? Many of the same rituals, many of the same practices. They've yet to really define, kind of a distinctive set of beliefs that differentiate it from the Catholic Church. So there are many who feel that, that's great that they broke with the Pope, but the job has yet to be completed, right? Further reform is needed. Very often the way they would have presented it, those who felt strongly about this, that the Anglican Church needs to be purified further of remaining Catholic elements, hence why many of these would-be reformers were known as Puritans. And so, by the way, we should note that many important Puritans were very important members of Parliament. And so they actually did have some influence and could wield some power in this regard. Now, the problem is going to begin with the death of Elizabeth I. She was actually very effective at kind of navigating this situation, right? So you had the Puritans who were demanding further reform of the Anglican Church, but then you had many in England who, first of all, many who were still Catholic, and so, maybe beginning to give up on the idea that the Church of England might somehow come back within the Catholic fold, but certainly not wanting further reform. And then there were many who felt that the whatever arrangement they had at that point was sufficient. If it's not broke, why fix it? Certainly, from the point of view of the monarch, it was a pretty much ideal situation. It kind of gave the monarch the equivalent authority of what the Pope had once had. So Elizabeth I was pretty good at kind of maintaining the status quo, but making sure that everyone was to some degree, happy with the situation. And the problem is going to be after her death. Now, part of the problem is that she never had a child, so there is no obvious heir to the throne. And so ultimately, she is going to designate the son of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who at some point she actually had to have killed, because she was very often plotting against her cousin Elizabeth. But she designated, so maybe she felt a little bad about it, but she designated her son, who was actually the King of Scotland, James VI of Scotland, as her heir to the throne in England. And so after she died, she would be replaced by James, and his title would be James I of England, James VI of Scotland. This would mark the beginning of the Stuart dynasty and also the beginning of the union of the crowns, because now you had the same monarch ruling both England and Scotland, and also Ireland, which was effectively a colony of England. We should note this is not quite the same thing as the United Kingdom, because they are still two very much separate, distinct governments. They just happen to have the same king, and actually that would have been a typical situation in Europe at the time. You had many kingdoms where they were distinct, separate governments, but the guy sitting on the throne would have been the same as somewhere else, right? But that didn't make them one united kingdom. Now, the thing about James I, and I'm going to call him James I because we're primarily interested in what's going on in England. There are two things, right? First of all, he was very Catholic, so not a big fan of the Anglican Church, and definitely not someone supporting further reform. Now, he was a pretty intelligent individual. He kind of understood that, there really wasn't any chance of returning to the Catholic Church. There had been an attempt under Elizabeth's sister, Mary, who had governed before her. She had been very fervently Catholic and had heavily persecuted Protestants, hence why she was often referred to as Bloody Mary. And let's just be clear, someone very different from Mary Queen of Scots, two different individuals. But in any event, James VI understood that just wasn't going to happen, right? I mean, that just would have aroused too much opposition. The other thing is he didn't like cooperating with the Parliament. As monarch of Scotland, there was no one else that he had to actually confer with. He pretty much ruled as an absolute monarch in Scotland, and he was quite happy with that arrangement. But again, he was a pretty smart guy. He understood that this tradition of cooperating with the Parliament had evolved over a long period of time, and it wasn't something you could just overturn. He made it clear that he was not happy with the Parliament, very often lecturing the Parliament about the divine right of kings to govern. But he was pretty clear that he had no intention of, actually changing the arrangement. He kind of accepted it, right? So very strongly Catholic, not a big fan of the Parliament, but accepted the reality of the situation in England at the time. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of his son, who governed after him, Charles I, and he would reign from 1625 until 1649. So very much like his father, right? What we call, he was kind of an Anglican at this point, but we would call him a high churchman, someone who valued the Catholic aspects of Anglicanism and had no intention of eliminating them, and a strong proponent of the divine rights, right of kings, right? So he's constantly at odds with the Parliament. The big difference between Charles I and James VI, his predecessor, his father, was, where his father was pretty intelligent and kind of understood that, this really is not, I don't like this arrangement, but there's really nothing I can do about it. He wasn't quite that bright. In many ways, he really, just felt that as king, he had the right to pretty much impose whatever he wanted. So not only did he make very well known his displeasure of having to work with the Parliament, but he would actively try to govern without them. Right. So, in fact, pretty much from the beginning of his reign, he tried to govern without Parliament. The problem was this just didn't work out. Right. At this point, the king has a very small bureaucracy. Right. So it's very difficult to enforce decrees. Right. He could issue a decree, but he didn't really have anyone who could carry them out. Whatever constituted bureaucracy was very much tied to the Parliament. Very often the same individuals who served in Parliament or members of the same family operating at a rather local level with respect to bureaucratic functions like collecting taxes, and they were not about to cooperate with the king if he was going to ignore the Parliament. Neither did England have a standing professional army at this point, so any decision he made with regard to foreign policy, he really had no way of enforcing it. It was basically the job of the Parliament to raise revenue in order to, they needed an army to round up individuals and create an army, right? But pretty much disbanding it as soon as, whatever had necessitated it, whatever the emergency had been, had passed, right? So, he's having difficulty collecting taxes. He has no bureaucracy. He has no way of actually carrying out his foreign policy, and eventually he caves. He has to call the Parliament into session. At some point, he's desperate for revenue, and so this is after quite a long period of time, a little bit more than 10 years, when he finally calls the Parliament into session, and they know that they have leverage at that point. So almost immediately, they're going to try and use their leverage to impose limits on his authority, right? They know that he desperately needs them. So this is going to mark the beginning of what sometimes is called the Long Parliament, because it remained in session for an incredibly long period of time and just tried to impose one restriction on Charles I's authority after the other. And eventually there are going to be divisions within the Parliament between those who want to continue to impose restrictions on the monarch and those who begin to feel that maybe we're going too far, right? So the Parliament becomes divided, some of them starting to become sympathetic to Charles I, at which point Charles I decides to stage a military coup against the House of Commons, kind of feeling that there are enough individuals in there who are supportive of him. So the idea is to send the army in, round up all those who are opposed to him, and then basically ensure that the Parliament is more cooperative. It doesn't go the way he plans at all, right? Those who are opposed to him, and in some ways you could say there are supporters of the Parliament or the idea that the Parliament should have more power, most of them are going to escape, including the chief opposition leader in the Parliament, John Pym. And almost immediately, all of England is going to descend into civil war, right? So from that point forward, people become very much divided between those who support the king, Charles I, those who support the Parliament. And both of them are going to round up their people, form armies, and England will descend into civil war. And so this will mark the beginning of the English Civil War. The English Civil War will actually last for quite some time, from 1642 until 1651. The supporters of the king, often referred to as cavaliers, which is derived from the French word meaning horse, chevalier, because most of them fight on horseback. Visually looking very much like you might imagine the costume of of one of the Three Musketeers if you were watching a film. And many of them are coming from the noble background, or at the very minimum a gentry background. Many of them kind of have their power base in the northern part of England. On the other side, supporting the Parliament, are going to be the Roundheads. So called because they wear their hair very short, kind of looks like someone put a bowl on their head and cut around the perimeter. Very plain and simple clothing. Often individuals who are not from kind of a fighting background, but they actually are going to make up the majority. Many of them based in London. Strong support of the merchant class, who obviously have wealth that they can use in order to maintain their army. And so even though initially the Cavaliers are going to do fairly well, eventually the Roundheads are going to become dominant. Now, one factor in favor of the Roundheads is that they do have some pretty impressive individuals among their leadership, one of whom, who eventually becomes the dominant figure among the supporters of the Parliament, is Oliver Cromwell. So he's one of the first to enlist in what's referred to as the Parliamentary Army. Very quickly shows talent on the battlefield, and before long rises to second in command with the formation of what's often referred to as the New Model Parliamentary Army, formed in 1644. Right, and this is kind of developing from a strategic point a more effective military fighting force. And this actually is going to mark in some ways a turning point in the Civil War. The following year, in 1645, they take Charles I prisoner in battle. Pretty much from that point forward, it's only a matter of time before the parliamentary forces emerge victorious. Along the way, they're going to put Charles I on trial and basically charging him as being a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer, essentially public enemy of the people of England, and they sentence him to death by beheading. And so, I should know, right? So they are going to execute him. This is going to send shockwaves across Europe. The idea that commoners have risen up, have taken a member of royalty prisoner, and then never mind harming a hair on the royal head, but literally removing his head, this kind of thing is going to shock people throughout Europe, right? Up until this point, really kind of the idea, it's not that kings were never overthrown, but they would have been overthrown by other individuals who had a claim to the throne, right? Members of the noble class, very often the most important families, right? But the idea that commoners would actually overthrow the king and then execute him is really going to leave people in shock. Now, as I noted, it's only a matter of time before the Parliamentary Army is victorious. The war is going to end with the Battle of Worcester in September 3rd of 1651, with Cromwell eventually becoming the dominant figure in the new government. And initially, there was kind of the idea of governing with the Parliament. After all, this was a parliamentary army that supported a strong Parliament. It's therefore somewhat ironic that at some point Cromwell is going to do what Charles I could not achieve. He's going to disband the Parliament, which had protested against being overtaxed, and effectively govern as an absolute monarch, though he won't take the title of king. Right? From this point forward, England is referred to as a Puritan republic, and he takes the title of Lord Protector. Now, Cromwell is actually going to prove to be fairly unpopular, and some of this reflects the fact that not only was he, first of all, he kind of betrayed the cause that supposedly he had been fighting for, right, as a strong supporter of the Parliament, and then disbanding it and effectively becoming an absolute monarch, even if not taking the title. But also as a fervent Puritan, someone who believed in further reform of the Church of England. He was somewhat morally rigid, right? So he's actually going to try and impose a very strict Puritan moral code on the English people. Kind of a feeling that they really have to live as proper Christians. This will also include outlawing the celebration of Christmas in the traditional fashion, which would have involved a lot of drinking, dancing, and revelry, which he felt was, inappropriate, an inappropriate way to mark the birth date of our Lord Jesus. As you might imagine, this, is effectively the Grinch is now the ruler of England. This is going to prove very unpopular. And by the time he dies, really all the English people want is to get back to some semblance of normalcy, inclusive of restoring the monarchy. Hence why this will mark the beginning of what we call the Restoration. A new parliament is elected in 1660, and one of the first decisions they take is to restore the monarchy. The question becomes, who should be the king? They offer the crown to Charles I's son, Charles II. Now, Charles II had gone into exile in the Netherlands during the Civil War. So, it's almost like, kind of sorry about, killing your dad. Maybe we can make it up to you. Would you like to be king? And Charles II says yes. Now, Charles II is going to prove to be exactly what the English people need. Right? He's very young, a very attractive fellow, an eye for the ladies, likes to have a good time, an irrepressible wit, something the British appreciate even until today. They refer to him as the Merry Monarch. And as I mentioned, during the Civil War, he had been in exile, actually first in France, then the United Provinces of the Netherlands. And he became very cynical about, politics and patriotism, this idea of being willing to lose your head for political reasons, right? I mean, he's, really a kind of like, I'm just going to enjoy being king. Now, the Restoration is unconditional. They don't say anything about the role of Parliament, but, he kind of understands that, this is how it works in England, right? You have to govern with the Parliament, particularly with respect to financial matters. Again, it's still kind of an informal arrangement. Nothing is resolved in that regard. But he's like, that's fine. It's good to be the king. I'm not going to get into it with the Parliament. I'm certainly not prepared to die for this. And in any event, most people in England want to get back to kind of, normal situation, which for many means getting back to making money, right? And this is going to be a very prosperous time in England. Now, if you had asked Charles II in your heart of hearts, what would you prefer? He would have preferred absolute monarchy. And he would have preferred Catholicism. But again, he recognized the limits of his authority. Much different than his father, much more like his grandfather, James VI, right? So even though, he preferred absolute monarchy and Roman Catholicism, he was very careful to mask his views. As far as the individuals he employed as ministers, he kind of mixed it up. Made sure that there were a fair number of individuals who were strong supporters of the Parliament. And most members of Parliament were not stupid. They were aware of his Catholic leanings. It was a cause of concern. But for the most part, it's kind of just keep an eye open. But there was little indication that he was really prepared, to try and somehow alter the relationship or, maybe bring England back into the Catholic fold. The problem is going to be with his brother and successor, James, who, upon the death of Charles II in 1685, will succeed him to the throne as James II of England, the seventh of Scotland. Now, you might note from his birth date, death date, 1633 to 1701, and, brother Charles II, he's pretty old when this happens. Now, he is a staunch supporter of Roman Catholicism. He also favors absolute monarchy. The big difference is, and this is very much like the pattern we saw with James I. Charles I, he doesn't seem to be that bright. I mean, he doesn't fully appreciate that as king, while in theory he might have absolute power, there is the reality of having to govern with the Parliament. And he is heavily distrusted. He's someone who they do feel might try to alter the status quo, right? That he might pursue religious policies promoting Catholicism, certainly preventing further reform of the Anglican Church, and policies that might see diminishing of the role of the Parliament in favor of despotism. Having said that, the Parliament gives him the benefit of the doubt, but unfortunately, James II, not being the brightest bulb in England at the time, he mistakes the lack of opposition as weakness, right? Kind of believing that, the fact that the Parliament isn't actively opposing him means that they're weak and really can't challenge him, and almost immediately is going to pursue policies that are going to raise a lot of eyebrows. So, for instance, he's going to begin to appoint Catholic ministers wherever possible. Now, up until this point, it had pretty much been forbidden for Catholics to serve in government, right? I mean, they weren't exactly being persecuted, but they weren't trusted. So you might have some, very strong proponents of, maintaining the Anglican Church as it was, not reforming it further. They might be serving in important positions, but you didn't have Catholics until this point. So that's going to really concern a lot of members of Parliament. And then shortly thereafter, James II is going to suspend laws discriminating against Catholics, as well as other non-Anglican Protestant denominations, but primarily it's about Catholics. So, you might imagine if you're a member of Parliament, you're really wondering where he's headed with this. Is he, is he laying the groundwork for bringing England back into the Catholic fold? But then other members of Parliament are like, let's not get too, panicky about this. He's pretty old. He's probably not going to be around much longer. Next in line is his daughter Mary. She's a strong Protestant. She's a strong supporter of the Parliament. She understands how things work. Let's just wait him out. And so for the most part, that is the attitude of the Parliament. But then the unthinkable happens. James Queen gives birth to a son. And that son would now be next in line, and all bets are off. The Parliament becomes incredibly alarmed. Again, both, not just Mary, but his other daughter Anne are both Protestant. And they were kind of counting on that. But now the male infant would take precedence as heir. Now, granted, he is an infant, but who knows how this will play out, right? Probably he would be... you'd have a regent who would govern on his behalf until he became old enough, if, say, James II died before he came of age. But who knows? Maybe he'll be a strong supporter of the Catholic Church. So there really is going to be a bit of a panic setting in. And finally, they decide, really on a rather remarkable course of action, if you really think about it. James' daughter, the very Protestant Mary, is married to the ruler of the Netherlands, the Dutch Protestant Prince of Orange, William. And so William is fervently Protestant. In fact, for some time now, he had been trying to get England to join a confederation of Protestant powers against France, which by this time had become one of the preeminent Catholic powers in Europe, in some ways replacing Spain in that role. England had always refused, partly because the rulers during this period, Charles II and then James II, both strongly in their hearts of hearts pro-Catholic. But in any event, he's fervently Protestant, right? So in 1698, a group of Whig and Tory aristocrats, so these are important members of the Parliament. We hadn't talked about Whigs and Tories. They basically represent two different political factions divided over, whether the Parliament should have supremacy or the king should have considerable power. Tories favoring a strong king, Whigs favoring a strong Parliament, but both agreed that the king should have to govern with the Parliament. Neither wanted to eliminate the Parliament, and both factions are dreadfully concerned about the fact that James II has just had a son. So they send a small delegation secretly to the Netherlands to invite William of Orange to invade England, in their words, to restore their religion and liberty. So really think for a second about how remarkable that is. The heads of the Parliament are asking a foreign ruler to invade their country and overthrow their king. And this is going to lead to what's known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, though actually carrying out over to 1689. William accepts the invitation, right? Not because he's dying to govern England, but again, because he had wanted to pull England into his coalition against France, at this time governed by Louis XIV. And, he's kind of figuring if he is actually in some form the ruler of England, that would actually make it much easier to do that. So he agrees, rounds up his army, lands on the southwestern coast of England. Upon hearing about the invading army, James II panics and flees to France. And that pretty much is the end of that. The only blood shed is basically that James suffers a nosebleed from his excitement. No blood is shed, and the transition of power will go bloodlessly and very smoothly. That is one reason this is referred to as the Glorious Revolution, the fact that it was bloodless. But more important, this event is going to resolve this question about the appropriate role of the Parliament vis-a-vis the king. In February 1689, the Parliament grants the throne to William and Mary. It will be a dual monarchy, right? She will have equal power, conditional upon their accepting the Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, upholding elementary civil liberties and declaring absolutist practices illegal, right? So there's kind of two sides to this. On the one hand, basically, really now making it official, the king must cooperate with the Parliament, particularly around financial matters. Bill of Rights kind of defining certain individual rights that the king has no authority with regard to, cannot encroach upon these basic liberties enjoyed by English subjects. And from this point on, we talk about England becoming what we refer to as a constitutional monarchy, which basically means that the king is now subject to the law. Right? I mean, this is very different. Until now, at least in principle, the king was not subject to the law. The law was whatever the king decreed. That is no longer the case. Additionally, in connection with that, the king must govern by parliamentary consent, right? Unless the parliament consents to particularly anything related to financial matters, the raising of taxes, the generating of revenue, how that revenue is spent must be done with parliamentary consent. So, England now a constitutional monarchy, meaning also that we have parliamentary government, right? The parliament actually consists of three organs, of which the king is one. The other two bodies being the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Right? So it's kind of the idea that the king does have certain functions that work within the framework of the Parliament. But both the king and the House of Lords have what we call extra parliamentary functions, right? They have certain functions within the framework of the Parliament, certain functions outside of it. The only body that has no function outside of the Parliament is the House of Commons, hence why very quickly the Commons ends up acting primarily on behalf of the Parliament. Whenever there is some conflict between the Parliament and, say, the King, or the House of Lords in its function outside the Parliament, it is the House of Commons that represents the interests of the Parliament. With regard to these extra parliamentary functions, the King effectively functions as an executive branch. He has the power also to convoke, prorogate, and dissolve Parliament, but he cannot legislate, right? He can only execute what the Parliament actually determines to be the law. The House of Lords, its extra parliamentary function is effectively the equivalent of a Supreme Court. So they have also this judicial function. So kind of summarizing the situation in England that has emerged here, you effectively have three branches of government. This is, very familiar to anyone who's studied even American politics. In fact, When they, created our system of government and, determined that it should consist of three branches, basically borrowing from what had come out of the Glorious Revolution. Now, what's interesting in the case of the Glorious Revolution, this is something that wasn't really planned in advance. It's something that just kind of evolved organically. Finally confirmed with the Glorious Revolution. But then, with hindsight, particularly intellectuals, looking at this situation, decided this is a pretty good thing, right? This is actually an effective form of government for a number of reasons. So, I mean, first of all, right, three branches. We're talking about a legislative branch, which basically comprises, in this case, the Parliament, particularly as represented by the House of Commons, but also to some extent the Lords. The House of Lords, which came to constitute the judicial branch, it exercised exclusive jurisdiction over the High Court of Appeals, even while having a share in parliamentary or legislative power. And then finally, the King, who effectively comprised the executive branch. But the thing that people really liked is that they actually had, to some degree, authority with respect to one another, right? So, for instance, the House of Commons, first of all, simply by controlling the purse strings, right? That sets limits on what the king can do. If you don't have money, it's very difficult to carry out whatever policy you want to pursue. But the House of Commons also has the right to impeach the king's ministers. The king, for its part, as we noted, has the right to convene, but also to bring the parliament to an end, basically to force new elections. So, all of this kind of, ability to interfere with the actions taken by other branches, we refer to as checks and balances today, right? And this was seen as a very, very positive thing because it was thought that this would prevent a recurrence of despotism, either by the king or, by the way, by the parliament, which, you could say is what happened with the English Civil War and the emergence of Cromwell as effectively a dictator. Now, it's not divided sovereignty, right? The idea that it's not this kind of hostile relationship of opposition, but rather a joint relationship or joint sovereignty, right? A practical basis for cooperation. Each parliamentary organ is dependent upon the other, and each accepts this system of dependency as legitimate. And so we're going to kind of finish there with regard to political developments in England. What we are seeing is kind of laying the groundworks for representative forms of government. Later on, many important thinkers from the Enlightenment who are thinking about what would make perfect government are going to look at what had happened in England as perhaps providing a model that they could build upon. For now, though, we're going to turn our attention to France, looking at concurrent developments, roughly corresponding to the period that we looked at in England, where we're going to see a very different kind of development. In both cases, we do see power becoming consolidated within a centralized government. But in the case of England, that government is going to see authority divided between the monarch and the parliament, resulting in constitutional monarchy. In the case of France, we're going to see authority consolidated in the person of the king. And this is a gradual process, but it will culminate with the reign of Louis XIV, kind of a series of centralizing reforms that basically see the emergence of absolute monarchy, right? Where you have a very powerful king who has direct authority over his territory, partly because we're seeing the development of a very large bureaucracy and also the development of a professional standing army, both of which answer to the king, right? And this is the culmination of a long process of centralizing reforms. We could, in fact, go back quite a ways, starting even with the period before the Wars of Religion, which we looked at briefly in connection with the Protestant Reformation. But we're going to pick up the story with Louis XIV's immediate predecessor. And that is Louis XIII, who became King of France in 1610 at the tender age of 9. And as you might imagine, if you're 9 years old when you take the throne, the likelihood is you're going to have an older individual governing on your behalf as a regent. In this case, his mother, the widow of his father, Henry IV, Marie de' Medici. And yes, that is the Medici family from Florence, who very often would marry off their daughters, in some cases into royalty. She will act as regent. Now, the thing is, up until this point, you had this process of kind of centralizing reforms, which basically, again, had to do with developing a large bureaucracy that would be directly answerable to the king and would allow the king to govern rather than through the nobles, right, who very often, particularly high-ranking nobles, who very often had a lot of authority at the provincial or shall we say local level. And so kings very often had historically to govern through them. If you have a large bureaucracy, you have the possibility of governing around them. And so these are the kind of changes that were happening during this period. Also, again, the development of a professional army, meaning that the king does not depend on the nobles for pulling together an army in a time of crisis, right? You have a permanent professional army who are paid wages and who answer to the king. Now, many of the nobles weren't happy with this, so imagine that we now have a 9-year-old king sitting on the throne. His mother, who, as it turns out, proves to be very ineffective. She's just not really up to it. And then, added to that the general prejudice about women, meaning that they were assuming that she probably was incapable, but as it turned out, they were right. So this would present an opportunity for pushing back on this process of reform that had seen power consolidated in the hands of the king, right? So here we have a 9-year-old on the throne, mother proving an ineffectual leader, a real danger of the nobles reasserting their authority at the local level. Everything at this point is riding on, is there anyone in government who can represent the authority of the king and continue with this kind of centralizing process of centralizing reform? And as it turns out, the answer is yes. That individual is the Cardinal Richelieu, who becomes France's chief minister in 1624. Yes, he is a cardinal, so a member of the clergy, but he is now going to become possibly the most powerful man in France. Some of you might have heard his name. He is famously the villain in the story The Three Musketeers, which is really unfortunate, right? He's a villain because in the story, he is presented as trying to undermine the king, and nothing could be further from the truth. For him, it was all about strengthening the authority of the king, continuing these centralizing reforms, developing the bureaucracy and so forth, minimizing the power of the nobility, and he was prepared to do anything on behalf of the king. For him, his famous maxim, very Machiavellian, right, like from the famous Renaissance diplomat from Florence who wrote the book The Prince about how to govern, the ends justify the means. For him, the state was above everything, even religion, right, which for him was first and foremost an instrument to promote state policies and to promote and maintain the authority of the king. And he proves really good at this. By 1631, he had done a lot to undermine noble resistance, even while expanding the king's authority, primarily by continuing to build up the bureaucracy. Primarily these individuals who were known as Intendants, royal agents, who again answered only to the king, and increasingly came not from the noble class, because you need educated individuals, and that's where many government ministers and so forth had come from until now, but increasingly coming from the bourgeoisie, right? Wealthy commoners, individuals who would not have dual loyalties, right? Like where they're, divided between their loyalty to the king and his interests and the loyalty to their noble family and its interests in the provinces. So Richelieu, very effective. But of course, Richelieu isn't going to live forever. He dies in 1642. Louis XIII dies the year after. You might be thinking, well, perhaps he learned a few tricks from Richelieu, could kind of keep up the good work. But in any event, he dies a year later, meaning that the heir to the throne, his son, Louis XIV, is only 5 years old. So we're right back to the same situation we saw with Louis XIII, right? In some ways, even worse. Not 9 years old, 5. Again, acting as regent. Louis XIII's widow, Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria. And again, she proves to be very ineffectual. The question now is, Richelieu is going to designate someone to replace him as chief minister, someone who could play the same role. The guy he chooses actually turns out to be a lover of Anne, her paramour, Giulio Mazarin, who's Italian, but in French more often referred to as Mazarin. So the big question is he going to be up to the challenge? So who is Mazarin? Well, he is a member of the clergy, in fact, a papal diplomat, recommended by Cardinal Richelieu, but there's little question that Louis XIII is not going to go along with this. And so he will really be the guy running the government for the duration of Louis XIV's minority. The question is he up to the challenge? Is he going to be able to continue Richelieu's centralizing policies? Strengthening the bureaucracy, keeping the nobles in check. And imagine for the nobles, the thinking is this is really the last chance to turn this thing around. And in fact, you could say they're going to kind of, test Mazarin to see if, maybe he's going to end up being a weak chief minister, right? So they're going to actually incite a series of revolts, mostly among Parisian commoners known as Le Fronde, where basically they begin attacking the royal palace in Paris, often using slingshots to project stones, breaking glass and so forth. Hence why I call it La Fronde. A frondeur is someone who uses a slingshot. And as it turns out, Mazarin is up to the challenge. In fact, he's going to use La Fronde as an excuse to further undermine the nobles. And by his death in 1661, the authority of Louis XIV is assured. And you could say that Louis XIV is going to seal the deal. Louis XIV will rule for a pretty lengthy period of time, 1643 to 1715. So kind of corresponding to the time of the English Civil War, the Restoration, all the way up to and beyond the Glorious Revolution, right? So Louis XIV, here's what's interesting. Some of the nobles were like, well, you know what? Maybe we can still make this work. Louis XIV had a reputation upon taking the throne as being, kind of a party animal, right? I mean, he just liked to have a good time, liked to go hunting, gambling, drinking, carousing, and so forth. So there was kind of a feeling like, look, he's not going to be interested in governing. If we can get one of our own people in as chief minister, we might be okay. Much to their surprise, as soon as Louis XIV takes the throne, he will take direct control of the government. There will be no chief ministers. Louis XIV will be a real hands-on ruler. He will rule directly through his bureaucracy made up of these intendants, most of which are not members of the nobles. In fact, at the highest level of government, the highest ranking members of the bureaucracy, those who actually sit down with the king every day, his ministers who help set policy, he will not permit that any of them are nobles. In part, this reflects developments that happened during Le Fronde. At one point, some of these Parisian commoners had actually broken in to the royal palace and had entered his bedroom when he was 5. And as you might imagine, waking up to see a large number of stinky, smelly Parisian commoners, and let's be frank, they did stink, would have been a bit traumatic. And he really had almost made a mental note of it. Like, when I'm king, this kind of thing will never happen again. He did not trust the nobles. And as it turns out, he is so perfectly suited to be king, right? I mean, particularly in absolute monarch. Everything about him just looks royal. His majestic appearance, he has this very robust physique, and he develops like the perfect manners. For him, it is always showtime. Everything he does, the way he eats, the way he walks down the hall, the way he might turn to talk to someone, is done in a kingly way. And he kind of understands that, in effect, he is a living propaganda for his own authority. In terms of government, he proves to be very effective as well. He has tremendous stamina and focus. He is able to concentrate on the details of government. But as you might imagine, even just playing the role of king, right, in the sense of having every mannerism down perfectly to the smallest detail requires tremendous stamina and concentration. And as I noted, Louis XIV is going to govern directly. No chief ministers. The king will determine policy himself. None of his ministers at the top level will be members of the bourgeoisie. In fact, members of the royal family or aristocracy are not admitted to daily council. The sessions where the king presides over, and deliberates on war, diplomacy, finance, and justice. He doesn't trust them, right? So whatever decisions are made will then be transmitted to the provinces by the Intendants, again, mostly bourgeois individuals, and they will supervise all aspects of local government, local administration, justice, the various courts, the police, and of course the collection of taxes. And, we cannot underestimate how important this bureaucracy is in the sense of allowing the king to govern all of his territory directly, right? Intendants had full powers in the fields of justice, finance, and law and order. They tried civil and criminal cases, suspended unsuitable judges, summoned special tribunals, regulated municipal government, stamped out banditry and smuggling, maintaining order at the local level, of course, levied and collected taxes, and drew the militia by lot. Any kind of local militia, again, responsible for maintaining basic order at the local level. As you might imagine, they were greatly resented by the nobles, who in theory should have been able to exercise power primarily through two bodies. Parliament, which were of which there were many kind of state courts at the local level, which was made up of nobles. They still met, but effectively had nothing to do. Everything was happening around them. And then also you actually had something that should have functioned as a national parliament, the Estates General, which still exists at this point. In theory, operating as a representative body, much like the Parliament in England. But it only exists on paper. Louis XIV would actually have to call them into session, and he just simply never does, effectively marginalizing the nobility. Finally, by way of further diminishing their power, Louis XIV encouraged the nobility to effectively trade power for privilege, right? So that they, in some sense, became almost useless parasites, right? They didn't play any really important role in terms of government. Some of them actually were productive economically, but a large number of them weren't. Certainly, there would be a growing perception among most French people that they were pretty useless. But a lot of this was actually cultivated by Louis XIV, right? So really, everything became about earning the favor of the king, right? So the idea was this was really the only way to advance socially. By earning the favor of the king, we talked a bit about how Louis XIV was extremely good at playing the role of the king. This was a big part of it. So everything became about, where you sat at the table at dinner, who sat next to the king, who sat further away, whether the king deemed to speak to you when he was passing you in one of these vast hallways in the royal estates, and so forth. And in fact, speaking of royal estates, really important in this regard was the relocation of the royal court to Versailles outside of Paris. Some of this kind of reflecting, this experience during La Fronde of having Parisian commoners break into the royal palace, right? This is kind of a way of assuring that kind of thing can't happen again. Versailles is about 40 minutes by train from Paris. But But it's going to be this very expansive royal court. The primary structure about a third of a mile in length, if you're standing in front of it facing it, the facade. And so the most important nobles were actually compelled to reside there. And we're talking about 10,000 noblemen on average, including then officials, various attendants, and so forth. And it's kind of, the idea of keep your friends close, keep your, shall we say, potential enemies closer, right? So, I mean, this, achieved many different goals. First of all, this kept them far from their own estates in the provinces, right? Their own power bases. Secondly, everything really became about, earning the favor of the king, right? Dedicating yourself to court attendance. This was the only way that nobles could attain favors, sinecures, and pensions. And of course, there were lavish entertainments. So really, this is where this, kind of idea is going to develop that they were effectively useless. By the way, that will be a factor leading towards the French Revolution, right? There's going to be a growing perception that they do literally nothing productive for France. And here's, kind of the kicker. And this is something all of the French peerage enjoyed. And most of them did not live in Versailles. Many continued to live on their country estates. But all of them enjoyed the privilege of not having to pay taxes, of tax exemption, right? So, imagine for the common Frenchman, there's going to be this kind of growing perception, and to some extent, not without basis, that these individuals contribute nothing. They don't pay taxes. They don't do anything productive. They don't play any kind of important role, politically, economically. At the end of the day, a lot of the tax revenue that the commoners are paying is devoted to keeping them entertained, to their parties, their hunting games, and so forth. Somewhat exaggerated, but there is some truth. But a lot of this cultivated by Louis XIV, right, in order to basically, you could say, kind of divert their attention and make them more willing to accept the fact that they were losing power. And we might finish with some beautiful images from Versailles. This is looking at it from the front. Of course, as you might imagine, it is a very major tourist attraction. So it actually was originally a hunting lodge that was then expanded beginning around 1682 into what it would eventually become, the Royal Court. And this is where it all happened. Today it's a state museum, just in case you're wondering. There no longer is any royalty in France. And, really a beautiful place to visit. If you're in Paris, if you have a few days there, you might want to devote one day to visiting Versailles. Probably most famous with respect to the interior would be the Hall of Mirrors, Le Galerie de Glace. And it's very rare that you would actually find it empty, devoid of people, as you see in this image, but extremely beautiful. Many important events subsequently in history, including the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, its negotiations, so forth, would take place here. And, equally enjoyable and quite beautiful are the surrounding gardens, right? So you have, imagine 14,000 fountains altogether in the royal gardens. French gardens are very famous for being extremely structured, very geometrical. And so, by the way, after the building of Versailles, right, and when Louis XIV at some point probably considered to be the most important monarch in Europe, other monarchs are going to want to have their own version of Versailles. So, if you're traveling through Europe today, of course you should visit Versailles, but you will find, equivalent royal palaces located far from the center that are, equally beautiful, but very often quite different structurally. So for instance, in Potsdam, outside of Berlin, you'll find Sanssouci. There, the gardens reflect more Germanic tastes, so they're kind of looking more like they came out of a Greek mythology, so kind of naturalistic, but very cultivated and so forth. And so concluding the first half of this lecture and concluding the story of Louis XIV, by the end of his reign, pretty much the nobles had no effective power. They pretty much were content with this, to live in his reflected glory, He was known as the Sun King, i.e., he generated the light. Others only basked in his glory, but basically giving up any autonomy such as they had had, under feudalism going back to the Middle Ages. And a big part of this story, is it's not just about the monarch himself, right? In the case of England, the monarch had to share power with the Parliament, but we see the growing centralization of power within the government. And a lot of this is the story of the development of a centralized bureaucracy. In the case of France, we talked about how many of its members came from the bourgeoisie, though now that the nobles had given up their power, increasingly we'll see many of the Intendants coming from the aristocracy. And we should note, so you have two different, very different developments in England, constitutional monarchy, and then in the other direction, absolute monarchy in France. The latter will probably be more influential over the next century, absolute monarchy becoming the prevailing form of government in most of Europe during this period. And finally, we should conclude by noting that this is also about the development of the state, where the state is now directly under the control of a centralized government that can exercise real power over all parts of its territory, all the territory contained within the borders of that state, very often perceived in the case of absolute monarchy, perceived as if the king and the state are in effect interchangeable. In fact, when Louis XIV was asked about the relationship between the king and the state, he famously said, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. Everything goes through me. The glory of France is, whatever glory I generate. And it is only by serving the state and in effect serving the king that one can achieve any kind of status, any real power. So achieving power no longer about somehow drawing power away from the king, but rather on the basis of pleasing and serving the king and state. That concludes the first half of our lecture. So do make sure to pick up with the second half as soon as you have a chance.